Hi, this is Dorian Lynskey, watching the Break It Down show.
We were just talking off mic. By the way, Gong is co-hosting with me. Welcome to the Break It Down show, Gong, and obviously welcome to the Break It Down show, Dorian. I just wanted to say before we get started here, you have written one hell of a book, man. I mean, it's one thing for George Orwell to write this book, and it's another thing to sort it all out. I mean, everybody claims George Orwell's stuff is theirs, which is that's masterful, and that's often, if it's by design, it's rarely accomplished. It's like when someone takes a song and it means something different to everybody. That's what George has done in this book that continues to be relevant almost 100 years later. So, one, welcome to the show to the both of you. And then I'm going to give the first question to Gong because he said it right, agog. I mean, it's such a great book.
Yeah, no, I was agog. I first read it last fall. I've read it another time a few weeks ago when I pitched Pete, this idea of bringing you on to this show. And I got to be honest. I mean, this is the first time I've ever read a book, with a living author, and then get to talk to them, shortly thereafter. So that's something pretty cool. Just by way of kind of like easing into it, because there's so much material that you cover, and I think the audience would really appreciate just the level of research and work. I mean, it's crazy that went into it. I read 1984. Like, I had to do the math on this one. Like, I remember reading in high school, for a modern European lit class. We read, Camus, Ibsen, Pirandello, and I remember that my English teacher made us read 1984, Brave New World, and Animal Farm in the same week.
Right.
And I was 16, and I did the math, and I read 1984 in 1984. And I was just like, this is crazy. So, Dorian, the book is a treasure trove of detail about George Orwell, his life, his progression through his kind of political ideas. You spend a lot of time, which is really incredible, about his involvement in the Spanish Civil War. You track his progression from the Spanish Civil War through World War I, World War II, and this, this constant rainstorm of influences, from writers to politicians, the really crazy, political collisions that were going on, in Europe at the time. And, when I read 1984 for the first time, we were looking at story structure and themes. We weren't looking at relevance and, practically nothing with regards to understanding, George Orwell, the man. So I would love for you to, just begin, kind of kick this off in terms of why did you write this book? Why did you find it interesting? When did you read 1984 for the first time? Because obviously it was a non-trivial impression on you, so that you would commit, so much work into writing this book.
Well, I would have read it early, mid-teens, and then I got into his later stuff in my 20s, and got into the essays, the non-fiction stuff like Homage to Catalonia. And weirdly then, it wasn't like I was this sort of Orwell obsessive. It was almost like he was too big to think that he was mine. Like with certain bands, like if you're really into the Beatles, you just know that you think, well, so much has been said about the Beatles. What am I going to bring to this? And then, so the way I came to it was really, I was fascinated by what the elements of the dystopian genre were, where they came from. Mm-hmm. Because we all know what they are now, whether it's like the Apple advert from 1984 or it's, the Hunger Games or whatever. We all know the deal. But I kind of was fascinated, like, okay, let's trace these back. Where do they come from? And then it turns out a lot of them come from 1984, some from Brave New World. And then it was like, well, where does 1984's ideas come from? And so it was really sort of following the ideas. And then that led me to this idea of, through telling the story of 1984, you're telling the story of Orwell, you're telling the story of his era, and you're also telling the story of a kind of genre, a way of thinking and writing.
Right. Well, I had to reread part one a few times. I've taught undergraduate level, political economy, courses, but I found that I never deeply understood, because it was such a chaotic time. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, so much foment and so much churn. Europe, Russia, Germany. It would take a lifetime to really parse out, the order of things. But I really appreciated the way that you did it with Orwell, because I think to understand Orwell's, and we'll get to this at some point, because I want to ask you about his time at the BBC India, how his kind of political views, socialism, communism, fascism, ultimately, he kind of just said, fuck it. This is about totalitarianism, and really fleshing out the details around that. And I just wanted to, get a sense of you yourself. Like, did you discover a lot of this yourself? Were those epiphanies and insights that you had not already known?
A lot of it, yeah, I didn't already know. And I was, the great thing about having this guy at the center of it is that you can follow him through this particular period of history. So you don't have to kind of constantly sort of pan back and say, okay, this is what was happening on the Western Front or whatever. You're not doing the history of the war. You're not doing the history of Stalinism. You're doing it through Orwell. And because Orwell was such a prolific journalist and at one point broadcaster, really everything of interest Orwell seems to have an opinion on. He's writing about movies, he's writing about plays, he's writing about books, he's writing about Hitler and Gandhi and Stalin, and so there's just so much there. And so I thought it sort of gave me this anchor, because obviously, like you said, there's so much history, there's so much to understand. And what I discovered, which I didn't really know, was that when at the time he went to Spain, late 36 through to early 37, there wasn't really a theory of totalitarianism. It was quite a new concept. And early on, when Hitler first came to power, a lot of people thought that actually what fascism was an advanced stage of capitalism. And then, because that made sense, right? Because it's like, okay, communism, and then the antagonist to communism is this very kind of like extreme form of capitalism. And that thinking began to change as people began to see the similarities between Stalinism, I would say Stalinism rather than communism, and Nazism. And then you had people, some sort of European theorists at the time, beginning to say, okay, well, this is totalitarianism. It sort of transcends, even though the end goal of both fascism and communism may seem to be very, very different, actually the methods are very similar. And so Orwell is like looking for wherever he can for just ideas, and there really weren't that many. There are a few books about totalitarianism coming through, but this really becomes the big idea of his adult life. It's what leads to 1984, and before that, Animal Farm. It's him trying to explain, and I think particularly probably to a sort of left-wing British audience that had some sympathy, obviously, with the original goals of communism, and also just sympathy with Stalin's Russia as an opponent of Hitler. It's like my enemy's enemy is my friend. And what Orwell was doing, which is quite unpopular at the time, was to point out that actually what Stalin was doing was not that different to what Hitler was doing. In terms of the use of power, in terms of the manipulation of reality, in terms of, propaganda and state violence, and obviously it manifests in different ways. And Stalinism wasn't as racist, wasn't as anti-Semitic, but there were more similarities, and actually the consensus view came round to that later on. But it came from the experience of going to Spain to fight fascism and then encountering Stalinists and seeing that the way that they treated socialists and anarchists, who were more Orwell's people, was so atrocious. And he was like, why did I not know this? Why was I not able to read this in the press in Britain? Like, why was I not primed to expect this kind of behavior? And then he came back and wanted to explain what he had seen and sort of build theories around that.
One of the things that fascinates me in history are these moments where the distance between yes and no for a value is a millimeter, 2 millimeters. Michael Phelps becomes the greatest Olympian of all time because he wins by less than a fingernail over another guy. Like you had to look with the giant magnetic robot to determine that he'd won this race. It was so close. What happens if Orwell dies in the war? I mean, you get shot in the neck. Most of the time you don't make it, or you're so incapacitated for the rest of your life, you're not able to produce as much as he was. Is he irreplaceable? Is he singular with what he did in the early part of the 20th century?
That's a really interesting point, because he is in many ways, because he was so idiosyncratic that what I realized is that even though he described himself as a democratic socialist, his version of democratic socialism, his sort of political worldview, which was mixed socialism, liberalism, and a weird conservatism, not political conservatism, but a kind of, affection for certain aspects of tradition. It was so idiosyncratic, which is why he was always arguing with everybody, that really there weren't many other people that thought like him. And so that balance that you're getting, because you can imagine a version of 1984 which is just purely not just anti-Stalin, but anti-socialist. I mean, a lot of people think that's what 1984 is, but it's not. But you could imagine a version of it like that. And if you look at the other dystopias around at the time, Brave New World, which is very, very different, is sort of the only one of that era that's lasted at all. There were lots that just weren't very successful. They're interesting, but then they don't endure. They don't work in the same way. And I suppose the closest replacement that you get for 1984, I think, would be Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, where it's obviously a non-fiction work, but she was at the same time as Orwell, she was trying to put together a theory of totalitarianism, and there's quite a lot of overlap between those two books, even though they hadn't read one another while they were writing them. So there's that sense it's replaceable. But if you look at all the different things that Orwell did, I mean, that is a very, very, very unusual character in his temperament and in his politics.
What's the result if he doesn't make it? Like if he passes away, what is, I mean, not to give you like a future history book to write or anything, but if he is irreplaceable, then what happens?
I guess something huge. I mean, there's lots of smaller changes, I think, if you look at his journalism and his non-fiction work. But I think something is missing in the dystopian tradition. I think so much flows from 1984, the fame of 1984, and that it itself inspired sort of landmark, works of television or advertising, like the Apple ad. It's so enormously influential, and it's very hard to sort of imagine what would take its place. And I think there was enough interest in the dystopian genre, but you need something that just has that kind of immediate impact and lasting impact. It's one of very few books that was hugely successful at the time, and then every year since for the next 70 odd years. Like, that's pretty rare. Most books, they kind of either start slow or they tail away. They don't stay. It's like staying at number one for 70 years.
We've used the word dystopian several times in this conversation already. You did spend quite a bit of your book discussing the emergence of utopian literature and the influence. George Orwell had very mixed feelings about various authors like Edward Bellamy, H.G. Wells, etc. Could you comment a little bit about, this immersion of this genre?
Yeah, so I had to go back because I thought if you're doing the history of dystopia, like you've got to think there's dystopia, which was a word that Orwell never used. It didn't really, it existed, but nobody really used it until I think the 50s or 60s. So after he died. So he sort of saw it as an anti-utopia. And so therefore you go, okay, well, what's the utopia? What's he reacting against? And you've got this book, Looking Backward, by Edward Bellamy, which comes out in 1888, 9. And is unbelievably successful. I think, sales figures are hard in the 19th century, but, I'd read that it was, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, the biggest selling novel of the 19th century. Like, it's this phenomenon, and it causes a sort of craze, utopia fever. So basically, lots of people who have political ideas thought, oh, the best way to get my ideas across is not in a manifesto, in a pamphlet, it's through a novel. But most of them weren't very good because they didn't really have plots. They just had people walking around the future, explaining things. Like that, there's basically nothing happens except explanation of the perfect world. And then you begin to see with H.G. Wells, who's a very conflicted character. He does utopias, but he also does anti-utopias. And in the case of a book called Sleep Awakes, it's sort of both at the same time. You can't quite tell what he approves of and what he doesn't. And it's H.G. Wells who makes it so, who makes that form so successful in the UK that people are obliged to react against it. So Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, is a reaction against Wells. E.M. Forster, The Machine Stops, is a reaction against Wells. And 1984, in a way, is a reaction against Wells, using elements of him. Everybody had this conflicted relationship with Wells where they were influenced by him and they admired him, but they just constantly wanted to disagree with him because he was just that kind of character. So it all comes out of argument, and that, I suppose, helped me understand what a dystopian novel, maybe not so much now, whereas a lot of the time they're just kind of thrillers or YA books, but I think the ones with a real kind of idea behind them, they're designed to be arguments. They're like, what is the ideal society? What is the nightmare society? How do these things come about? How do people live in these societies? And so I thought, yeah, okay, you've got to start with this craze, this very idealistic man, Edward Bellamy, basically trying to make socialism palatable to Americans. And so he was, again, another kind of quite eccentric character who made up his own version of socialism.
I'm curious what your thoughts are. When Thomas More writes Utopia, obviously he's playing with words, and it's ooh versus you, and is it a place, is it no place? And a lot of us understand that it's also a satire, much like Animal Farm. Does Orwell see his work as the progeny of Thomas More's work? I mean, or is that too much of a leap to say that? I mean, because we all start talking about Utopia because of Thomas More and Erasmus's conversations, and and are there Hoffler days in the modern utopia? What would you call like the overall? Because it's not just dis, it's ooh, it's all the different utopian based things. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he doesn't really write much about More, and the thing, I mean, very little at all, just in passing. And I think the thing is with Orwell is because he wrote so much, almost everything that he was interested in, he wrote about. And so there, for example, were books that I had to write about where I thought I'd love it if Orwell read this. I'd love to know for sure that this was an influence or that he had some understanding of it. But if it wasn't mentioned in any of his journalism or notebooks or whatever, that there is almost it seems unlikely that he did read it because he wrote about so much. And so we find out, for example, that he was much more interested in Gulliver's Travels. If we're talking about going way back, that to him, the sort of ideas of utopia and dystopia and the satire in that was a huge inspiration, and he definitely saw 1984 in some sense as in the tradition of Swift. It's just like taking things that you've observed and exaggerating them to an absurd degree. And it's one of the things that makes 1984 so powerful, but also really unusual for Orwell. There's virtually no jokes in it. It's satire with almost all of the humor eliminated, and that's why perhaps sometimes it doesn't read as satire. That's why a lot of the time people think it was a prediction, because satire is meant to be funnier. And Orwell was a very funny man, but he wanted to make this book terrifying. So I think, yeah, rather than Moore, obviously Moore takes credit for the, you know, the word, the concept of utopia. And then there's a whole other complicated tradition of various utopian literature over the centuries. But I think it's more Gulliver's Travels that was the sort of the earliest thing where he thought, oh, this is a really interesting way of exploring political ideas.
And I'm going to give Gong a question soon, but I got it because it's just fascinating to me. So when we talk about Swift and Gulliver's Travels, we always think of the big and the small worlds and everything, and we never think about that next world he goes to where the immortals are bananas. Like they reach a certain age and it's no longer valuable. I mean, there's a whole nother leg of his stool that we just never, ever discuss. We don't ever think about it. Does that impact Orwell at all? And I will shut up and let you talk about it. It looks like you have some thoughts.
I'm doing some memory. I think it's part 3. I think it's part 3, which he said was a big influence on him, because he says that it's sort of like a police state. It's like an 18th century version of a police state. And Orwell was really interested in, he was so interested in totalitarianism that he saw it everywhere. So he saw it in Shakespeare. So he writes a great essay about Macbeth, where he's saying that the atmosphere of Macbeth is the atmosphere of a police state. It's kind of fear and paranoia and a sort of madman in charge. And he detected that in there's a passage in, I think, part 3 of Gulliver's Travels, which was like that. So yeah, for him, he wasn't really interested in Lilliput and Brobdingnag. You know, he went to those bits that don't tend to get adapted into the movies because they're not as fun. They're actually really quite sort of dark, complicated satire of politics and science in the 18th century. This is just not as fun as Little People.
Gong?
Well, one section of your book, which I found particularly fascinating, was, he's in Spain, he gets shot in the neck, he's cobbling together career, as a journalist. He does write a few novels, predating 1984, that don't really reflect, any of these, concepts that we're talking about. But what I found really thrilling to learn was his stint at the BBC, which was a program that spoke specifically to the Indian audience, British colony, and I got the sense that that's where he really learned the art of propaganda.
He did, but I must admit, I assumed that he learned it by doing it. But the work that he was doing for the Indian section, and hardly anybody listened to it. This is why he eventually quit, because he just realized that there weren't many people with radios in India, and of those, only a small percentage were listening to this service. So he was like, why am I doing this? But the propaganda he was making was very soft propaganda, in the way that I suppose comparable to like Radio Free Europe, where you're really, you're not sort of blasting out kind of, what we would identify as propaganda. You're basically trying to represent the best of the Western liberal democracies. So he would do poetry programs. He would do adaptations of short stories. He was actually quite an innovative radio producer, awful presenter. There were complaints because his voice, he had quite an unfortunate accent. And also because he'd been shot in the throat in Spain, it had this kind of weird sort of thin, reedy quality. So apparently it was horrible. There's no recording survived. It's horrible to listen to. But he was a great thinker on radio. He really understood what would work. So, and you can see all of the transcripts of everything that he produced. And there are some news reports, but they're not what we would think of as propaganda. But in order to do this work, they had to listen to the Nazi propaganda. And that was where he understood, how that worked, the language that is used, the kind of the repetition, the emotion, just that the whole filth, as he said. It was just like constantly listening to this, filth from Berlin. And also he was learning sort of audio techniques. And I think there was a story that just sort of for fun, as an experiment, he cut up one of Churchill's speeches, or a few of Churchill's speeches, to make it sound as if Churchill was declaring an end to the war. So just kind of like snipping up different lines, which now, of course, you just think, well, oh, right, yeah, you can do that now, editing software and deep fakes and stuff. And it was like this very, very early deep fake, because he just wanted to show that it was possible. And go, wow, you can really manipulate people and make them believe something that hasn't happened. So he observed a lot about propaganda, even though the stuff that he was himself putting out was kind of really benign. It was just, him talking about how much he liked Jack London or
whatever. Pete, do you have a question?
No, go ahead. You do one.
Yeah, well, it might be good to kind of jump into the meat of 1984 and why, certainly he didn't know, in 1946 to 1948 that it was going to have such a profound impact and legacy, on culture, and I think you argue in a lot of cases in politics itself. And that was really surprising to me. You had written one thing which I found really intriguing, that America was George Orwell's blind spot. And I was wondering if you can kind of comment on that, because 1948 is when it was published. Where World War II is over. Where the whole world is dealing with the aftermath. Of everything that happened. Still, putting together, putting sense together about the meaning of it all. But I found that interesting because, let's just fast forward to the 21st century. Today's politics, Pete and I have, are in the United States. There's a panoply of political issues that do echo in themes that he played around with in the late 1940s, like racism, cancel culture, wokeism, people literally employing techniques that he describes in 1984, but not under the INGSOC banner, but just in what we claim as everyday life. But I'd love for you to comment, like, what was it about America? What was the blind spot?
It's weird. He wasn't interested enough in America to sort of to give it the kind of thought that it deserved. And some of his friends observed that the thing with Orwell was that there was a lot of stuff he was interested in, and if he was interested, he was kind of obsessive and passionate and so excited, and the things that he liked, the authors he liked, he would write about them again and again. The political ideas, anything that interested him a lot, and then things that didn't interest him, it was just like he just didn't bother. So, for example, sport, no interest in sport. Loved working class culture, but no interest in sport. So, like, his version of the working class, like, nobody watches, nobody's interested in sport. And so there are all these kind of blind spots, and one of those is America. Even though I think the first book he ever tried to sell in the early 30s was a biography of Mark Twain. So he was interested in certain American writers, and he kind of romanticized the sort of early mid-19th century when he thought that it was very, he liked that sense of freedom. But a lot of the time he wrote about America in this rather condescending way, that it was just like he admired its sort of pluck and energy, but thought that it just made a mess. I think in the book I say he saw it as just like a kind of big, lovable, a big puppy that, you admire the spirit, but he's just running around smashing everything. And so it's kind of, he writes about certain aspects of American culture, certainly certain American authors like Twain and Jack London, with respect and interest. And then in other times, he's just sort of just so condescending, and incurious in a quite sort of disappointing way. And yet you know, it's America that makes him wealthy, relatively wealthy, because he was really just scraping by. That's why he did so much freelancing, because his books didn't sell enough. A lot of the freelancing wasn't paid very well. And so it isn't until the Book of the Month Club in America publishes Animal Farm, and then it becomes a bestseller. Finally, he's got some money. But there's a story that until that came out, he never bothered opening a tax bill, because he knew, like a letter from the tax office, because he knew he hadn't earned enough to pay any tax. So he's just like, there was no point. And then suddenly he was just like absolutely horrified. I was like, you won't believe the tax I got to pay on Animal Farm. And then he really had an American audience. He wrote for a couple of American magazines, one called Partisan Review. So he had ties to that kind of sort of democratic socialist, left-leaning liberal sort of circles in the States. But yeah, he was planning to visit towards the end of his life, but he was too busy. There was one plan he had, which was to sort of do some reportage going through the Deep South, because he did actually write about a few times about race relations in America, and how he thought this was the real kind of this real sort of stain on America. And he saw the way that some of the black soldiers that were stationed in England were being treated. I mean, obviously some of the racists there were in England as well. But he was kind of interested. He was interested in that, and he was interested in writers like Richard Wright. And I think, that could have been fascinating, because I think he was beginning to show a real interest in the life of America rather than his own sort of crude caricature of America. And that, Pete was asking earlier, okay, what if Orwell had died earlier? Well, that's one of those things where you think, well, what if he died later? And I think we would have seen Orwell really grapple with America. I think, obviously, the success of 1984, I think people would have wanted him to go over there and, do book tours, write for more American publications. And the timing was wrong. He just missed all of that.
Isn't it possible, too, that he's just a man of his time? I mean, we look back on America's last 150 years, and it's pretty remarkable, the amount of growth and the influence. It went from being this place where people rode horses, and shot each other with guns in saloons and stuff to, okay, World War I, yeah, great. But that could be like, they're part of it. We're part of a bigger thing or whatever. I mean, America wasn't America, I think, for a lot of people in his era. And then the other thing I'm curious, and this is a different topic, but who's collecting the royalty checks today? Because he doesn't leave an heir. His wife has been dead for 40 years or whatever it is. So if you could cover those two things, I'd appreciate it.
I don't know. I mean, there is an estate, and his adopted son, Richard Blair, is still alive. But I mean, it's not like he takes all of that money. The estate was money to various people. His novels have now just come out of copyright. A lot of his stuff has come out of copyright. Anything that was published in his lifetime. More complicated is some of the sort of anthologies of his, letters and uncollected, previously unpublished essays and stuff. They're still in copyright. So now actually it's kind of, there's all kinds of new editions because it's out of copyright in Britain. In America, your copyright laws are kind of just gone forever. But here it's just like it's just past that point. So I actually wrote the foreword to a new edition of 1984, and there's quite a lot of new editions now. And they should be able to do some quite interesting creative work. I think it'd be interesting to see sort of new adaptations and stuff. But I don't actually know. I suppose because it was outside the scope of what I was trying to do in the book. When you consider how many tens of millions of copies 1984 alone has sold at Animal Farm. And I don't actually know where all that money has gone, because I've met Richard Blair and he does not live like Jeff Bezos.
I mean, someone's getting some money somewhere from that. So, yeah. And what about being a man of his time in terms of his perception of America? It wouldn't be hard for someone to dismiss America that part of the 20th century. Sure,
and I think there was a lot of anti-American snobbery in England at the time. I think with Orwell, it was more the question of that he wrote best about what he experienced. So he goes to fight in Spain and writes an amazing book about the Spanish Civil War. He spends a time kind of not quite homeless, but working menial jobs, traveling around in down and out. He writes down and out in Paris and London. He works at the BBC. He understands propaganda and office life, and they appear in 1984. So, like, everything in his novels has come from his real life. He writes about imperialism because he was an imperial policeman in Burma and became kind of disgusted, felt very guilty about that. And so that's why I wish he'd gone to America, because I think as soon as he actually went somewhere, because he was a very good observer of people and of culture, I think that would have clicked into place, because then it would seem like, oh, it's a real place, and he needed to immerse himself. But because he was distant, and we're talking about an era before, obviously just before television, so you got to wonder, like, what did he know of America? What did he understand of it? And so, yeah, I would say probably part of that condescension was very much of its time. I think a lot of his peers were similar, and there was a sort of rapid growth in the 50s with just more international travel and television and just more exposure to American culture. And hopefully he would have sort of outgrown his he hated Hollywood. That's the other thing. He was a movie critic who hated Hollywood. So most of his movie reviews are like, at best, this is entertaining. At worst, it's like, this is morally disgusting. He was like a really bad film critic, because he just thought America was just horrible and was like really crude, which doesn't quite add up to the affection with which he wrote about English working class culture. Like, so it's not like he was a snob all round.
Well, you did allude. I mean, he did have a passing interest in the general subject of racism. It's a theme that doesn't show up in 1984 at all.
Not in the final version.
Right. I mean, it's not an explicit theme. I think what you wrote was his conception of totalitarianism and the solution for controlling a population through language, etc., was really about the ideology, the reduction of language, the introduction of a very truncated language, the neologism like doublethink, newspeak, etc. Those I feel are some of the greatest innovations in terms of sort of conceptual ideas in 1984. And I was wondering if you could just sort of speak to, how that evolved, because they obviously we've seen a resurgence of that language in today's politics. Something as Orwellian, or you can unperson someone, and there's a great appendix in 1984 which actually explains how newspeak works, and that's not really quite discussed, but we see it manifested in culture today, like for real.
Well, just to address your racism point, one thing which I had no idea about until I read, there's a reprinted manuscript which includes all the surviving pages of the early drafts, and you realize that in the first or maybe second draft of 1984, race was a part of it. Racism was part of the system there. It actually talks about there's anti-Semitism. It talks about a lynching in America, and he cut that stuff out. And it's interesting to see why. And he explicitly goes, actually, there were, it didn't matter what color or religion you were, as long as you believed in the ideology. And I think perhaps he was just like, do you know what, if I can't, this sort of concept of this book cannot contain this whole other axis of, sort of power and oppression. And so he just sort of left it out completely. But it's interesting that he did think about it. So yeah, so what he was trying to do really was distill this idea of, okay, like, how does power work? One of those things is in the restrictions of language. Now, I don't think we have that now. I think we have a proliferation of language, proliferation of voices. What I find, I suppose, a little problematic about sometimes applying the 1984's terminology to some of the arguments that we have now, is what it meant then, like the seriousness of what he was talking about, and that most of the stuff in 1984 actually happened. You know, something equivalent happened under Stalin or happened under Hitler. So unpersoning then was erasing someone from a photograph. It was removing their name. It was genuine erasure. Rewriting history then, the sort of rewriting history he's talking about, is genuinely like banishing the history, not just saying, oh, here's a different take, which might annoy some people, but literally making sure that you could not get to the original material anymore. Now, I think what we have in Western societies is something quite different, which is a big, noisy, constant, exhausting argument about all these kind of things. And so if you've got, you know, there are competing versions of history and people are smashing against one another. Like, do you like the New York Times, the 1619 Project, or don't you? You know, do you think that, you know, a certain novel or film is sort of problematic, or do you love it and you think people should leave it alone? It's like, but it's all out there. There's a huge argument. What we don't have is that kind of methodical censorship and erasure that he's talking about in 1984. That is the mark of totalitarianism, which is like genuine censorship, as opposed to just sort of like fierce arguments. That, you know, you can rename because in Britain, and I know this is also happening in the States, but in Britain we seem to be obsessed with statues. Like one statue was brought down, like literally one, but it's become this huge debate. And people go, isn't that Orwellian to remove a statue? And it's like, well, if there is a kind of proper sort of debate about it, and there is a discussion of the history, that's not it. If the name was erased from the history books and then people could be arrested for saying the name, okay, that's sort of Orwellian. So I think that the concepts are always useful. And sometimes every day I come across something and I go, oh, that's quite doublethink, or that's newspeak, or that's genuinely Orwellian. But then I always just take a step back and go that what he's talking about is totalitarianism, and what you can see. Some of those things are happening in China now. Some of those things have been happening in North Korea for decades. Some of these things are happening in sort of authoritarian states in Eastern Europe now. What we have, I think, is maybe a sort of opposite problem, which is like just noise, like noise and rancor, which is healthy in a democracy, but can seem so heated. And then sometimes you want to call your opponent Orwellian. I think the temptation to call your opponent that is so strong. And not that I'm Orwell's, like, you know, guardian here, but every now and then I just feel obliged to point out, like, okay, we're not at totalitarianism yet. And his own ideas about freedom of speech, and even what was, of course, not in the 1940s called political correctness, are complicated and they're different. And in some ways you just go, man of his time. And then in other ways you go, oh, wow, this is really progressive. But a lot of that stuff is kind of buried in like magazine columns and letters and less well-known stuff. And I would love to do almost like an edition of 1984, which just had some of the journalism alongside, where he's talking about his thoughts on boycotts, on free speech, on language around race, like stuff that I honestly had no idea that he had even addressed. But it was just in like one fleeting sort of column. And it's much more complex than the version of Orwell that people use in arguments.
This is a great point, because we tend to take someone's words and we beatify them if they reach a certain level, you know, and sanctify their work and turn it into canon. But I bet if we were to ask George, you know, we would say, hey, you know, how good was whichever book it was? Be like, you know, there were so many things. I mean, every writer I talked to, Dorian, like, they're like, these are things that I just couldn't put in the book because they didn't fit within that linear line of what I had to do, you know, and yet we take all this, like, again, Orwell belongs to everybody, you know. one of the things we've done here recently is we like in the last year, we have dug up the following people and chastised them for being bad people. John Wayne has been dug up and brought back from the dead. Laura Ingalls Wilder has been brought back from the dead. And just this week, Dr. Seuss. Never mind the fact that there are people actually doing horrible things today. We're so obsessed with that. I don't know what you think he would make of that reanimating of authors to chastise them and try to close the book on them. But in general, he also had worse bad guys, I think, to deal with. Stalin is a pretty horrible person.
Yeah.
Obviously Hitler. And then for whatever reason, the Japanese get off pretty easy nowadays. But if you actually look at what they did, and America, by the way, but Japanese were pretty horrible too, wherever they were occupied. They were pretty awful. So he had really good bad guys to work with. Yeah.
And I think that's what gave him a real sense of perspective. I do sometimes wonder, right? Okay, I think there are debates to be had about what we do with certain, books or films or TV shows, which have elements to it that don't really sort of fit now. Like, what do you do with that? However, the amount of coverage that Dr. Seuss has received is so enormous. And of course, in Orwell's time, it was just like, well, no, because you've got Hitler and you've got Stalin and you've got Imperial Japan, you've got Mussolini, you've got death camps and then later the atomic bomb. It was like big stuff. But he did say the two points I think are relevant here is that one thing when he wrote about Ezra Pound, who was an actual fascist sympathizer who did some broadcasts from Mussolini and an anti-Semite, was he was going, well, he shouldn't be banned, he shouldn't be censored against, but anti-Semitism is just not the doctrine of a grown-up person, and anyone who goes in for that kind of thing should face the consequences. So that I thought was interesting, because he does say, well, look, there should be consequences. You don't ban people, but if somebody has an extremely kind of hate speech, free speech in itself is not just like an excuse, doesn't cover everything. So him on Ezra Pound is really good. And I think the other thing which I was reminded of this week with the Dr. Seuss thing is that didn't Dr. Seuss himself regret the illustrations that have become controversial? So it's almost like in his own lifetime, he was like, yeah, not so proud of those, product of a different time. And one of the things I find most inspiring about Orwell is his own cognizance of his own early failings. So in the 1930s, he wrote some anti-Semitic stuff. It wasn't viciously anti-Semitic. It was just in a kind of a casual, unthinking way, not in a kind of fascistic way, but it was anti-Semitic. And he recognized that later and really disowned it and really said, look, I understand the power of anti-Semitism because I grew up with it. And he sort of denounced that. And he really did try and evolve. And so my response, I suppose, with a lot of people is to just look at them in the round and go, okay, right, you can take one work, one illustration or one passage, and it can make someone seem one way. But then you can look in the round and go, okay, right, actually in their time, they're quite complicated. And like a lot of people, it's like, well, they were very progressive in this way. And then they were kind of influenced by their parents in this way. And then they were just kind of a bit petty and obnoxious in that way, because Orwell could be petty and obnoxious as well. So writing this book just really made me want to, and there's only so many hours in the day, but to try and understand these figures in the round and not like a screen grab of one page in a tweet, which can make somebody seem awful. You could make Orwell seem like an anti-Semite by taking a line from the 1930s and missing out the essay he writes in the 40s about how bad anti-Semitism is. So that, I suppose, would be my plea to kind of get more sophisticated responses here, is to actually look at the people in the round and maybe their evolution.
Yeah, that in the round concept is important because we often get lost in the detail. Again, like utopia being ooh or you, is it a satire? You're basing entire political philosophy on a satirical paper. It can become a problem if you don't have this thing. Or anti-Semitism. we're talking all Semites or just Jewish Semites? I mean, because then we're talking about Arabs and Middle Eastern folk in general. These things get really complicated if you start assigning a singular point of view to all of them. What's an Asian? Is Paul Anka a Lebanese descent dude? Is he Asian, or are Lebanese people who live in Asia not really Asians? I mean, life is not as simple as we want it to be, especially if we don't read the book that we're using as our reference for our data. It's shocking. That last part of the book where you're talking about that. Wow.
Yeah. No, it does sort of. No, I do find it very weird how many people cite it when they've clearly missed major points, large parts of it, misunderstood it massively, which is, I suppose it's one of the rare books that's become a kind of myth. And there's some books that become so famous, it's almost a mark of fame that people will misunderstand you. Like, there's a lot of people that think Great Gatsby is a book about like a fun guy that throws parties. And not about this terribly psychologically disturbed fraud whose life falls apart. And so, 1984 isn't unique in that, but the way in which people argue about it, and what struck me was the way that people were doing this in 1949. You literally had people on the left claiming it and people on the right claiming it. The only people that didn't claim it were Stalinists. They still hate it. Modern day Stalinists still hate Orwell. But everybody else wanted to claim it, and so in a weird situation where there's somebody like, Senator Josh Hawley, on whom I imagine I agree with him on nothing, and he's citing Orwell, and I've written a book on Orwell, and it's like, well, who gets to, I'm not arrogant enough to think that I get to own Orwell, but how odd that you have this, like, somebody who is so contested, and a book that is so contested, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, it was one of those reasons that emerged as I was in the middle of it, was just to make people read it again and to sort of think about it, because I think it's cursed with being a book that you read when you're young, and it sticks in your head, and you think, well, I don't need to read that again. And actually, you should read it again as an adult, because 13-year-old you or 15-year-old you, whatever, probably missed a lot. And to certainly to sort of think about the way that concepts and language from it are used in politics now, you sort of have to go back to the source, and you have to think, okay, why did he write this? What's in it? What is he saying? What are the kind of weird little wrinkles in the book itself? That's something that is not just fulfilling, but also just means that you won't kind of end up retweeting a fake quote from 1984. Which is a hazard. A lot of people do it.
Gong, you got another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment for the audience that Dorian's book is structured in a way, it's two major parts. The first part is, Orwell's life and his various influences that led up to him writing 1984, and unfortunately he passed away, 2 years later, 1950. The second part of Dorian's book is really about once the book was unleashed, into the world, how it was received, and Dorian breaks it down to how was it immediately received, to global politics in the 60s, the 70s, and I think probably my favorite chapter in part 2 is the chapter called Orwell Mania, which was, a nice coincidence of the title and the year, where you outline with a lot of detail about how culture has reflected, on the impact, of the novel. And maybe you can kind of touch on that, for the audience, because there's some really, I saw the, kind of a trajectory from moral philosophy to aesthetics by the time the year 1984, from the famous Apple Macintosh, commercial that Steve Jobs commissioned, to even the film, 1984, which was, produced then. But there was a lot of activity. Was George Orwell a prophet? No, he didn't get anything right. So, there's not a lot of credence to it, and let's just put it in a vitrine and just, keep it there. I would just, if you can comment, because that was a really rich chapter.
Well, it started in 1983, and so in fact, by January 1984, you already had people writing articles about how bored of Orwell they were, and it was the focus for everything. I mean, there was so many new editions came out, but even like new editions of Brave New World came out, for example, just because it's dystopia year. And the film, there was the advert. Although if you actually watch the Apple advert, you realize it's more based on H.G. Wells than 1984. It's not really. It's sort of weirdly not like 1984. And there was a merchandise, and Margaret Atwood started writing The Handmaid's Tale, which is I think just a nice coincidence, but it certainly seems sort of relevant. The amount of coverage is phenomenal. That it also produces Neil Postman's book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a sort of classic of media studies, and that came out of a panel on Orwell. And there was this sense at the time, like this book cannot survive this year, because it will have been proven wrong as a prediction, or people will just be sick of it. And I suppose there is a bit of it does tail off a little, and particularly as you see in the end of communism as well. And so there's a little tailing off of relevance after that. And maybe it had been overdone. But, you look at it now, you look at its relevance now, and it's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we're like 37 years on from the year 1984 now. And it was never meant to be a prophecy. It's just, he made a decision quite late in the day to change the title from The Last Man in Europe to 1984. And therefore it became the first dystopia to put the year in the title. Now, every dystopia was set sometime, but it was set near in the title, and it was close enough. It wasn't like set in the year 3000. And so it just created this kind of like perfect storm of interest. And there were books that I was coming across in the 70s, political books, going, what will the year be like in 1984? Marketing reports for various businesses going, the world in 1984. So even like 10, 15 years before, it had become this really important symbolic year. And it sticks. Like, why is it Wonder Woman 1984? Like, it needs to be the 80s, could be 83, could be 85, but there's something about 84. And it's sort of remarkable to put a stamp on a year and then to survive that year, to not be made redundant, for not people to go, I guess he was wrong. And there's so much in that book that every era we're in, something new becomes of interest. It might be the technology, it might be the nature of truth, it might be the language, but there's always something.
It's funny that today, if he was to publish that book, and I talked to a lot of authors, the publisher would be like, that title's no good. And it would be some long colonnated title with the subtitle. They would miss the opportunity of doing that. Well, first off, I wanted to say thanks for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. I'll let Gong have another question or thought if he wants it. But I just wanted to say, one, good job being the Orwellian book salesman of the year. But more importantly, everybody should buy your incredible book, The Ministry of Truth, the Biography of George Orwell's 1984. This guy continues to sell books, so it's smart to write one about him. I hope you write that next book, too, where you can do a concordance with his other work. I think that would be, you can continue to read his stuff. And like you said, when you're 15 and you read that book, you don't have an adult brain, so you just remember that where are the pigs? Why am I not being entertained by 1980? It's just, you have to read it again. You're so right about that. So for me, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. I'm going to let Gong close up his part.
Yeah, just one final comment. I learned in your book that INGSOC is a truncation of English socialism. And I never knew that. I had never even thought to consider asking, what does it mean? And so that was a pretty searing insight.
That was his version of his satirical version of Nazi, obviously National Socialism there, i.e. not real socialism. Although at the time, loads of conservative reviewers, thought that he was having a go at socialism. So right from the off, I think from like week one, people were kind of reading his book in ways he hadn't expected. So you can't really be surprised that it's still being argued about now.
Right.
One more thing I want to say. Thanks for Americanizing from row to argument for us, because we're, we don't get those fancy words.
Is that too English? Okay.
That was great. All right, stand by one second.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much